Okay, welcome to the after morning coffee slot. My name's Simon Garrett. I'm Head of Learning at the Bristol Zoological Society. And what I'm going to do actually first of all, while you digest your tea and your coffee, is I'm going to tell you a little story before I introduce my three guests here on stage. I don't know how this story is going to go because I made it up yesterday on my way back, on the drive back from London, but this is the world premiere of this story, which I dreamt up, which is probably going to fail badly, but let's give it a go. I want you to think of an ancient being, and I'm going to call her Wilhelmina de Bios, just for fun. She's ancient and wizened on the inside, but amazingly beautiful on the outside, and constantly changing and renewing this exterior. And for countless generations, for as long as people can remember, people have been coming to her, and she's been providing food, sometimes in tasty packages that they can just pick up and eat, sometimes requiring a little bit more ingenuity to make these tasty treats palatable. And she never asked for anything in return, she just provided. And more people came, and more people got what they needed. And some of those people actually took a little bit of control over this food supply and started growing and planting their own. But still, sometimes they'd come to Wilhelmina, and she would, I don't know why I called her that, maybe it'll become clear later, and she still provided, and still looked beautiful on the outside, was obviously very wise, wizened on the inside, never asked for anything in return, but she'd provide bees and bats and beetles to take the pollen from one flower to another that people had planted, a little bit of magic to sprinkle the rain in the right places, never asked for anything in return. Other people came to her with ailments, aches and pains and bits falling off and gammy legs, and she would provide salves and ointments and things to take the pain away. Some of the things that she came up with were inspiration, and people copied them. And every time people came to her, she would provide and never ask for anything in return. And generation after generation after generation came to her. People with chaos in the mind as well would come and spend time with her. And the longer they spent with her, the more they found the chaos in their minds was calmed. So she was a great benefit to these people, but she never asked for anything in return. Of course, every now and again you get a fantastic harvest or a great cure for an ailment, and people wanted to have huge celebrations, or sometimes in times of sadness as well. And they took great inspiration from Wilhelmina, and particularly from her external beauty, and perhaps from something from her wizened heart as well, and they produced amazing sculptures, paintings, poetry, songs, music, inspired by the beauty of Wilhelmina. And she never asked for royalties or anything in return. But then those who chose to look noticed that she wasn't always as beautiful as she had previously been on the outside. Little bits were falling off. Something was obviously taking their toll. And yet people still came. And the food-focused people started noticing this, or a few of them did, and berated the others and said, lay off, leave her alone. Can't you see that actually all that we're asking her now is taking too much of a toll? We need her to produce the food. We need her to sprinkle the rain. We need to provide the bees and the ants. And they were focused on their food, and they told everyone else to lay off and leave her alone. The medicine people were berating all of the others and said, you lot leave her alone. Can't you see that the demands we're placing on this ancient being are taking their toll? Bits are falling off. She's not quite as beautiful as she used to be. And the artists would say to all of the others, all of you leave her alone. Can't you see that the amount we're asking her is finally taking its toll? And after a while, a few even decided to see a little bit closer, to see what they could do about it. And they took a look, and the more they looked, the more they realized that actually this ancient, wise, beautiful being was nothing more than a beautifully, intricately constructed automaton, worked beautifully for eons. And the more they looked, the more they also realized they knew very little about how this beautiful and ancient automaton actually worked. But they definitely needed it. That story's got a beginning and a middle. I'm not sure about the ending yet. Maybe we'll sort of go towards constructing an ending for that story, or continuing it, or maybe it doesn't have an ending. Maybe we'll just take it forward in some sort of sense. So perhaps to help us to do that, we have some people who are going to come from perhaps some of those areas that I've alluded to or mentioned, and talk to us a little bit about their areas. And who did I say we're going to bring on first? Chris,
Yeah.
I'm going to start with you. So Chris, and I want to get your title right as well. I should have put all these bits of paper in the right order, shouldn't I? Chris is representing here the West of England Rural Network. And you're going to talk a little bit about what you do and your perspective on this, and perhaps whether you refer back to my story or not, I don't know, because no one's ever heard it before, but give it a go. So Chris Head.
Thank you. Are you okay with me sitting down? Or do you want us to stand up? You stay sitting down, is that okay? I just wanted to say a couple of things, really. We've got a small slot that we've each been given to say things. This is a completely alien environment for me in many ways. I work at a very strategic level. I work with government, I work with local authorities, I work with other charities, other third sector organisations, and Savita got me involved because I'm on the steering committee for the local nature partnership. And one of the things that really got me thinking about was around boundaries and around artificial boundaries that we impose on things, whether those are local authority boundaries, whether those are local nature partnership boundaries, AONBs, green belts, all of these sort of lines we like to put around things. We're very linear in our approach. If we can see it on a map, that's good because we know what it is and we can control it. But of course, one thing that nature doesn't do is it doesn't respect boundaries. It doesn't, bees won't stop flying over a line because they're going outside of an AONB or outside of a national park. Birds don't sort of say, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not flying there, I'm going to somewhere different. So actually, straight away, we falsely constrain ourselves with boundaries. The other boundary that I was thinking about was around the boundary of time. And a lot of my work is around with politicians, both big capital P politicians and local politicians with a small p. It is around how you get things to fit into their timescale. And local politicians have a 4-year timescale. We've got an election coming up in Bristol next year for the Mayor of Bristol, who's only been in post for 4 years. So when you talk about political cycles, actually a 4-year political cycle, you're spending your first 6 months to a year trying to work out what it is you're going to do, and then your last year you're spending actually campaigning for your next re-election. So actually you've only got like sort of a 2-year bit in the middle where you can actually do something. So if you do it at a national level, assuming you have a government which is in place for 5 years, you've only got a 3-year window in the middle. That's a really, really short timescale for nature. And one of the things that I was really struck by, and particularly very, very early on, one of the earlier speakers about the orchards. In a previous life, I worked for the National Trust. And I used to get huge amount of pleasure driving to work each day because we used to have to go up this huge, great, long, winding drive that was full of the most enormous lime trees. And they were just absolutely, it took my breath away every time I did it, no matter how many times I did it. And then someone said to me, of course, you do realise that the person that planted those would never, ever, ever have seen anything that looked anything like that. Those trees have been there for 150 years, or approaching 150 years. So it's something about how do we translate our vision, our longer term vision, how do we get it away from the political cycle of a very short 5-year time frame, even shorter. But nature is a long-term thing. We're very used to having trees that instantly appear, fully grown trees that instantly appear in shopping malls and developments. Actually, they take a long time to come. So something about how do we get it long term. And I think my final point, and it is my final point, Savita, is around how do we engage with the people highest up in organisations. I've so often been frustrated by thinking I'm engaging with the right people, and then when it actually gets to be delivered on the ground, it's so watered down or so anodyne that it doesn't happen. You've got to keep engaged with those people at the highest level. And I think that's our challenge, both for how we can make sure that these things really get through, is engaging at the highest level.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to ask Alison next to tell us a little about what she does and perhaps respond to. Alison is the director of the Royal West of England Academy.
Which is here in Bristol. I hope you're all going to visit if you haven't already. If Chris was wondering why he was here, that's nothing to what I'm doing, because I am an art historian who runs an art gallery that is also a museum. The reason that I think Savita invited me along is that we have been working with the Green Capital and presented a series of exhibitions to promote and interpret the Green Capital. Art is predominantly one of the oldest and most fundamental forms of communication. And what we feel that we offer is a way of communicating to audiences that you may not reach with your messages in other ways. The museum sector as a whole is very sympathetic to environmental messages. In order to get the accreditation to be a museum, you have to show that you are thinking about the environment in how your building operates. The Royal West of England Academy is what's called a happy museum. We are part of a happy museum community of practice, and one of the principles of the happy museums is to be a steward of the future as well as of the past, to think about the contribution that we as a sector are making to the lives of future people. And that whole happiness principle, again, ties us as a creative sector and you as the environmental sector together. Because the consumerist society, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, is kind of predicated on unhappiness. Because if you're happy with your latest iPhone, why would you buy the next one? You have to have that thing of wanting to be in fashion, wanting to... so it's a constant cycle of feeling unhappy with what you've got and wanting more and more and more. Whereas the whole thing about the principles of happiness are treading lightly on the planet and being aware of the nature around you, getting out and contributing and giving back to, what was her name?
Wilhelmina de Bios.
Just to sort of exemplify what I was saying right at the start about how art communicates, we did an exhibition last year called The Power of the Sea, which was curated by an art historian and an artist. But through that exhibition, we held a symposium that involved environmental scientists, climate change scientists, and so on, who we found a way of bringing all these different communities together to look at issues. And sometimes that creative, left-of-field way of coming at things comes up with a solution that perhaps you might not have thought of. It also means that several of the artists were dealing with environmental issues in their work. Now, that exhibition wasn't just visited by art lovers. We're a host for events. So big businesses were coming in and engaging with the exhibition because they happened to be using our beautiful space for their canapé reception for their guests. And suddenly they get messages coming across that they might not have got. Next, year after next, we're doing an exhibition about air, carrying on the water to air to eventually fire. We've got that one planned as well. And an organisation called Arts and Health are planning to hold their international conference here in Bristol and are theming the whole conference around airborne illness, airborne pollution, to coincide with the exhibition. So, like I say, there are ways of reaching audiences. And to finish, I'll just give an example of the power of that, which my sister reminded me of this morning, which was an exhibition I presented when I worked at the Glenvivian Art Gallery in Swansea many, many years ago. Clearly, I was barely out of nappies. I worked out it was 21 years ago, by an artist called Clive Landon. Have any of you come across Clive Landon? He did a body of work called Familiar British Wildlife. He went out as an artist photographer to document British wildlife and found that the vast majority of what he saw was squashed at the side of the road. So that's exactly what the exhibition was. It was how most people, particularly at that time, this is pre-spring watch and autumn watch and so on, were engaging with wildlife, was seeing it under the wheels of their car. And why I feel that that's a really good example of how powerful a communication tool the arts can be is that resulted in me getting one of the 2 death threats I've received in my life. Because I was silly enough to say in a press release, I know exactly what the artist is trying to say, because the only time at that time that I had seen a badger, it ran under my car as I was driving along. And somebody clearly thought that I was deliberately driving over badgers and that this exhibition was a celebration of how we should all go out and kill wildlife, which was entirely the opposite of the message. But that's how upset people get, how engaged people get if you use a medium like an art exhibition.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Bruce Laurence is Director of Public Health for Bath and North East Somerset, and is going to come with his perspective.
Okay, you're getting 3 very different and equally unfocused presentations. Well, not focused, but we're all coming to this not quite, with a very general brief. So I will tell you a few things, and they may make sense and they may not. I'm certainly not an expert on nature, conservation, biodiversity. I'm originally a doctor, and now I work in the council in public health, which is about I suppose it's about answering the question, what makes us healthy, what makes us unhealthy, who is healthy and who is unhealthy in society, and how can we use any means to improve people's health and reduce health inequalities as well. Early in my career, I worked in medical relief with people like Médecins Sans Frontières, and worked with nomadic tribes and in places under acute environmental stress. And I think just as I was leaving that sector, the Darfur war started, and that was possibly the first very clear climate change aggravated conflict, and a sign of more to come, I would imagine. It's obvious that from a health perspective, our species depends on others. Many of you might know, and some of you might not, that as you sit in your chair, 90% of the cells that are sitting within your body space are not yours anyway. They're bacteria in your guts, in your skin. And we're starting to realise they might have a function, and wiping them out every so often with antibiotics might not be a brilliant idea. And more than that, our DNA is a hodgepodge of bits of old virus and bacteria and human and our species ancestry, so we're all sort of colonies anyway. It's well established, and that the case doesn't really need to be made in medical or health circles that contact with nature is good for our physical and mental health, and nature's our natural habitat, so that's not a big surprise. But even though the health system focuses on drugs and operations and expensive treatments, there is a small but growing sector of ecotherapies where people suggested that often for their mental health, but also for getting them more active and losing weight, they make contact with nature through animal husbandry, through allotments, through working on farms and so on. That's not my particular thought about the way we should link health and, I mean, it's a small area. More largely, I think we just need to get that message across of how important natural environment is for our health, not just as the foundation of our health, but just the benefits of everyday contact. And hopefully through doing that, we will start to explain perhaps to generations to come that therefore that nature needs to be looked after if it's going to be there. I think the health service is in a particularly bad state. Some of us think it's in some sort of death spiral at the moment, and me in public health, we've been ejected from the health service, so the people who were most focused on prevention have been pushed into councils. Some of the partners who might be interested in your message are people like myself in councils, people like Public Health England and the other public health bodies and academics. So I think there's commonality with us. Just a couple more slightly random points. When I did look up biodiversity slightly in preparation for this, and I noticed that the argument was made very much in terms of what does biodiversity do for humans, what does it do for us? And I mean, to someone who used to be interested in, or still is in Buddhism, I think Buddhists made the point that there was a moral basis for biodiversity, and Jains do as well, and then philosophers like Peter Singer make the point that it isn't just about what can nature do for us, it's what does nature have any rights, and maybe some of the way we need to get the discussion going is both along a more self-interested and a larger moral kind of approach, and I'm sure many of you do that. I'd make a point that urbanisation is a big movement, and much of my effort, I recognise that I'm not going to get a lot of people going out to beautiful countryside, much as I might like to, and I think we have to be focused on city ecology as well as rural and make sure that balance is right. I'd say don't lose heart. It's easy to think we're losing some great fight for biodiversity and nature, but I would always say that we don't know where we would be if people like yourselves hadn't been banging this drum and making the case over decades now. Maybe it would be much worse, and perhaps the fact that there are a lot of laws and regulations in place, imperfect though they are, and perhaps the fact that governments have to pretend to be interested in nature, whether they are or not, is a sign of progress and not just something to be completely cynical about. And then one slightly more, I was asked if we could say something provocative. Sometimes when I talk to people in our local sort of sustainability partnerships, there seems to be this sense that technology is an enemy. And I hear very, you can't have anything to do with GM crops, you can't have anything to do with nuclear energy. I'm much more interested in history than public health, actually. I should have been a historian and not a doctor. And looking at history, I think there have always been two huge drives to human progress. One has been moral progress. We've expanded the group of people from family to tribe to nation to humanity that we accord actual rights to. So I think there has been moral progress, although one could argue that. But I think technology has been a huge part of how humans have thrived, and if there is to be salvation, it has to lie in both the moral and the technological. So maybe some of us have to be perhaps a little more open-minded and harness the best of technology and not be too resistant to things, even if they don't accord with some of our values. So that's my random set of observations from the ignorant.
Thank you. Thank you for these random observations to start with, following my random story. I'm going to ask initially a few provocative questions, and then perhaps you've got some forming in your minds here as well, and we'll open it up shortly. You mentioned here, what has nature ever done for us? I mean, you've mentioned all sorts of things here, health benefits and mental health benefits and inspiration for the arts. And you said earlier on, actually, when we were talking beforehand, was it okay to use the term ecosystem services? In fact, you didn't, but we could. Of course, the title for this bit is What's in it for wildlife? So what's the other way written? So actually, if nature is so good for our health, and if doctors are beginning to prescribe nature walks instead of antibiotics, rather than the money going to the drugs companies, should somehow money go to providing something to keep those walks nature rich in order for them to deliver their health benefits? So, well, that one straight back to you, Bruce. Do you think there should be some way of actually getting money from the NHS or private medical care to maintain nature so it maintains its health benefits, or are we just doomed to always having it for free?
I think in a small way that is happening. I've seen we invest very small amounts of money in, for example, when I worked in Derbyshire before, something called care farming. So we would pay a fee for farmers who were struggling. Derbyshire was hill farming, post foot and mouth, very much struggling. So we'd pay a small amount of money, and part of farmers' diversification would be to take that and it helped them look after their farm. So perhaps in a small way we're doing that, and in another small way we're doing it by being part of making the case for various bids for funds that come in to improve wildlife, improve parks, improve the Bath cityscape, for example. It's happening a little. I think the way the health service is at the moment, and probably the way its priorities always will be, that's a minority sport. I actually think if you really want money from health to fund natural protection, it probably has to happen mostly at the higher level by the way the government chooses to use its resources, by making that case that the environment is important for health. It will help prevent ill health, will prevent the downstream costs of that ill health, and therefore at that level money should be moved around for the right reasons, which to some extent happens. So that's the sort of quick answer.
Okay, thank you. And it may not always be money, maybe just support in other ways.
Yeah.
Chris, you want to?
So one of the sort of the linkages with that is I'm involved in the Bristol Avon Water catchment project. So I was talking earlier about not liking boundaries. Well, this is a different boundary, but it's absolutely based on water catchment. And it's making the link between, someone said earlier about the starlings that were feeding from the sewerage outlets. So this has made the connection between the people responsible for the sewerage, so that's Wessex Water in this case, have realised that actually it is better for them to invest in things like making sure that people aren't on antidepressants and that farmers don't use nitrates to fertilise their soils. And it's better to invest in it that end of the spectrum than it is for them to invest millions and millions of pounds in taking those out of the sewage. Because actually, I think the cost of taking out the sewage, and I apologise if there is anyone from Wessex Water here, I didn't see anyone. Is it anyone from Wessex Water? No? Okay. But it was, it was costing, 60, 100 million pounds to take this stuff out, but they could invest £6 million in a project around mental health and well-being to stop people being on antidepressants and or to stop farmers using nitrates further upstream. And then, so they've got a cost benefit of a ratio about 10 to 1 in actually doing it that way round than just treating the raw sewage when it comes out. So I think that's the other way to engage with people, rather than just sort of thinking in those little silos that we've all got about how can we deal with this little project here or this little issue here, just spreading it out wider. And this is where a forum like today is really useful, is to spread it out really wide and get all those people around the table and the sort of not the usual suspects together and having those discussions. Because that's where, and Simon did say, I wasn't going to say about ecosystem services, but that is kind of what it is, and it's sort of the next stage on. It's about how do we make sure that the environment is, and this is Savita's phrase that he came up with when we were doing the local nature partnership, the environment is an enabler. It's not a blocker, it's an enabler. And quite often it's been seen as a blocker. And how do we make sure that actually the positive story we've got is around making it as an enabler and making sure those things, which actually help the whole, our health and well-being, the environment, all those sorts of things can come out of that. And I think that's really important.
Which of course goes on, I mean, this is absolutely addressing, this is the whole theme of this conference is about partnerships. And this is not unlikely partnerships. We've got some very obvious connections here. So it's how do we join up all of these things? How do we think big and think differently to actually achieve the outcomes in a more coherent way that benefits all of these areas? Alison, you.
One of the vital things to me about achieving the support, whatever source it's coming from, is having that hard data, being able to say, you're spending 60 million now, you could spend 6 million. And one of the principles of the Happy Museums is measuring what matters. One of the things that the Happy City here in Bristol, which is the world's first happy city and an example being learnt from all over the world, is how you actually evaluate the effect that being in the environment, being with nature, contributing to nature, is having on people's mental well-being. And I think the more that we can build partnerships across all sorts of different organisations to make sure that those kind of measuring tools are there to be able to go back and give the hard data is essential.
So here's my provocative question for you then, Alison. If it's about outcomes and measuring the positive benefits, I'm sure using the arts is a great communication tool. Some have suggested, I mean, thinking of Bristol Green Capital this year, some of the funding went on arts projects, and many people have said, well, why do you spend money on the arts when actually that money could have been better spent planting a tree here or protecting that area there? Actually, we've wasted it on some transitory arty-farty thing. There, sorry.
Well,
the question's been asked.
It would be more provocative, and I'm going to sound terribly bitter and twisted here, if any of it had gone to the Royal West of England Academy. But despite hosting the inaugural event for the Bristol Green Capital, none of it did. But I don't think it's an either or. I think there is space for supporting both and for using one to facilitate the other. If you look at a project like Luke Jerram's Withdrawn, I'm ashamed to say I went to Lee Woods for the first time in my life to go and see Withdrawn, and saw God knows how many hundreds of other people there as well, going for exactly that reason, because it was getting them out to an area of beauty that they might not have gone to, because they're coming at it through the arts perspective. And the same as me saying about the Power of the Sea exhibition, the exhibits there that the artists were concerned with environmental impact and were expressing that through their work, and people who might not be natural recipients for your messages are getting them in another way, and that might encourage them then to start behaving differently, to dip their hands into their own pockets and support environmental issues. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Which also just recurs to me, thinking back to the previous session on the media, actually framing, getting things in almost subversively, actually getting to an audience that otherwise normally wouldn't have come in by framing it in an entirely different way. Oh, that's the kind of programme I'd watch, but actually the subtext might be something quite different. Bruce?
It's been interesting moving from the NHS to the council and thinking about the way information is used and arguments are made. And we in public health, we're very much into the evidence base for treatments, and we fondly believed in the NHS that the health service was evidence driven. It wasn't. It was partly evidence driven and partly politically driven and partly financially driven, and so on and so on. But moving into the council, it's made it much clearer that really the way you engage people, whether they're policymakers or politicians or technocrats, is got to be both with evidence and science, and an emotional and a narrative engagement, and they absolutely have to go together. And in the end, hard-headed policymakers might want to see evidence of cost effectiveness, but the pressures on them from their democratic public will be based partly on that too, but will be based equally on emotional responses. But that's where art comes in, that's where having a good narrative comes in, that's where exhibitions come in. So I would never say money spent on engaging the imagination is wasted, and it's also life enhancing, and if we're not here all in some ways to help enhance life, then what's the point?
Okay, I'm going to open it up, but I'm just going to throw in one more thing just for me. I'm abusing my position as being here on the stage and can be able to say what I like. I'm particularly interested in the idea of getting health benefits from nature, but I'm also sure I've read a study somewhere that there's a study that's often cited that people recover better when they're in hospital if they've got a view of a green space out through their window than a brick wall. I believe another follow-up study has shown that actually it doesn't even need to be a real view of a green space, but actually a picture will do. So we're going to be slightly... It's a bit scary. We're going to be a little bit careful about the claims that are made and make sure that we're making the true and real claims and find the evidence. And, something that we know, perhaps as a gut feeling, we need to make sure that it's backed up with evidence and not kind of thrown out of the window, even if it's an artificial window. Okay, let's open it up to the floor. We've got just over 10